My name is Anna Musniaga, and I will be the chair for today's webinar. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to the webinar titled Disaster-Induced Internal Displacement in India, Protection and Reporting. So today we will be talking for about 90 minutes, and we have 4 speakers lined up. And I think I will introduce each speaker just briefly before we start. So first speaker is Professor Chaya Badraj. I hope Chaya pronounced your name correctly. I'm sorry if I don't. So Professor Chaya Badraj is a professor at OP Jindal Global University. And she will talk about the internal displacement in India, specifically looking at disaster-induced internal displacement in India in the year 2020, based on a blog that she published recently. So Professor Chaya, the floor is yours, and you will have 15 minutes for your presentation. Many thanks.
Everyone, I am excited to have you all on this panel discussion with us on disaster-induced internal displacement in India. I started working on this particular topic during my summer fellowship with Refugee Law Initiative in June 2021. And before I begin discussion on the topic, I would like to give thanks to Dr. Anna, who had helped me through understanding the nuances of this research. Beginning with the topic that I am discussing is the blog article that I had published with the University of London Refugee Law Initiative, which is an overview of the disaster-induced displacement data in the year 2021. To begin with, I would like to highlight that there is enough evidence today to assert that environmental threats like disasters and extreme weather events can push movement of persons both across borders and within a country. The movement within a country is also known as internal movement, the topic for the panel discussion today. We are discussing more on the nuances that are linked with internal movement of people within a country in relation to disasters and extreme weather events. The forcible nature of disaster-induced movements within a country causes it to be known as internal displacement, or internal, and the people who migrate or move because of this forcible nature of disasters are known as internally displaced persons. Additionally, it is also evident that environmental factors like climate change and other sudden and slow onset disasters will be one of the biggest drivers of human migration in the 21st century. One of the key to protect the people displaced due to disasters, both internally and across borders, is monitoring and reporting the estimates about these disaster-induced internally displaced persons. An adequate reporting and monitoring mechanism can allow the stakeholders to act and better manage human mobility in the context of disasters and climate change. Although there are many national and international forums like the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center that releases an annual report on global reporting on internal displacement, they have certain methodological and categorical limitations. And through my work as a summer fellow with the University of London, I focused on these limitations and I highlighted the gaps that existed between the national reporting on disaster-induced internally displaced persons and the global reporting by the global report released by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. What I essentially did was I compared the IDMC, Internal Displacement Monitoring Center's 2021 report against the reporting on internally displaced persons in India to provide an alternative estimate of disaster displacement in India in the year 2021. And through my research, I underscored the limitations that arise out of the existing data tools that these reporting and monitoring centers use. For example, the national statistics on disaster-induced internally displaced persons do not include data on certain concepts like displacement risk and are often aggregated, limiting the use of such data. But the implications, but there are a lot of implications that the incomplete data can present before the policymakers or the decision makers who are aimed at protecting these people. I mapped disaster displacement in India to provide a chronological overview from January to December in the year 2021, including disaster events that were not included by the existing reporting tools on disaster-induced internal displacement in India. So generally speaking, both nationally and internationally, the tool that is used to a certain report and monitor the number of people who are forcibly displaced due to disasters and who are forced to move due to disasters and extreme weather events. These people do not include people who are moving because of industrial disasters and disasters like COVID-19. And my research particularly highlighted it. In India, for example, the displacement that followed COVID-19 lockdown and travel restrictions within India was not included in the reporting of 2021. Reporting and monitoring of disaster-induced internally displaced persons is incomplete if disasters such as COVID-19 or other pandemics or industrial disasters are not included or are not taken into consideration. My fellow panelists, Ms. Malvika, will highlight the technicalities that are there about how and why these displaced persons displaced because of pandemics should be included within the broader understanding of disasters. My other panelist, Professor Krishna, will discuss the gender health implications, and Professor Anil will discuss the need of the integration of disaster-induced internally displaced persons in India. But I am highlighting the need to report, to collect data, and to monitor data and reporting of these disaster-induced internally displaced persons. Because in my research, I highlighted that it is one of the keys or one of the stepping stones to start discussing and start formulating policies for the protection of these DIDPs or disaster-induced internally displaced persons. An exclusion or lack of data, reporting, or protection measures for people affected through COVID-19 related crisis or COVID-19 related migrant crisis created a data gap in 2021, particularly in the context of India. And that is likely to carry policy making implications for internally displaced persons in general. The sources that are used by the international and national organizations like the IDMCs to draw estimates on internally displaced persons are generally media reports, government reports, and social media reports. These reports are then triangulated or corroborated and put together to come up with the estimates of those who are displaced because of disasters. Generally, for national and international reporting, COVID-19 and industrial disasters are not considered as disasters and are not considered as triggers for internal displacement. Even though there is mounting evidence to suggest today in the 21st century that all disasters are fundamentally human-made disasters, even then, within the reporting context, the people who are displaced because of industrial disasters and people who are displaced because of pandemics like COVID-19 are kept at bay, and they're excluded from the data reporting, monitoring, and generally, consequently, because of the lack of data reporting from protection framework as well. One of the lessons that we can learn, because of COVID-19 related migrant crisis is that there is a need to reevaluate the current understanding of internally displaced persons generally in India and around the globe, because this understanding can give us a fresh start to understanding who disaster-induced internally displaced persons are. What is the accurate data? What is the accurate monitoring that should follow these disaster-induced internally displaced persons? And how can, as policymakers or stakeholders, can follow a more holistic and inclusive approach to look at these internally displaced persons? With that being said, I would like to conclude my part of the time. So that is my time. Thank you so much. I finished before the time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Chaya Badraj. I think you've set the scene very nicely for this webinar. You also indicated how your presentation is connected to other speakers. So, well, today we're focusing on India. Of course, this is not to say, I mean, disaster-induced displacement is in fact a global problem. It is a significant problem, obviously, for India, but I think it's also, I mean, it's a truly global problem that both, countries of all the income levels should be concerned. So next on our list today will be Professor Sneha Krishna. Sneha, I hope you're there, and she's a professor from O.P. Jindal Global University in India, and she will talk about gender health and disaster-induced internal displacement in India. So adding a gender lens to this discussion. So Professor Sneha, you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaya and Anna, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. I am actually basing today's talk based on a decade's research in Assam in the northeast of India, but I'll also add insights from the work that I've been doing in Bangladesh and in South Sudan while talking about disaster-induced displacement and living in a pandemic, so the impact of cascading disasters as well. The papers that I'll be talking about talk about two different aspects of disasters and displacement, one being the impact of recurring disasters.
I think there might be some technical difficulty. Sneha, are you still with us?
I think there is some technical difficulty due to which we've lost her. Do you think we could move on to Ms. Malvika's presentation?
You think we will go with Malvika's first?
Yes, because I'm not sure, like, she could continue then after Malvika's presentation.
Okay. Well, Sneha, just one more time. Okay, if not, then as suggested by Chaya, we will go on to Ms. Malvika's presentation. Malvika, I can see you're there. Thank you. So sorry for the technicality. I mean, we're all sort of joining from different parts of the world. So before hearing from actually Professor Sneha, who just started speaking, we will first hear from...
Sorry, I'm back.
You are? Okay. So Sneha, maybe this is best for you to continue now, and then Malvika can speak after. Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, no, there was something wrong with the Wi-Fi, so I had to connect to another network. So just a bit of context of Assam. Assam is actually home to the Brahmaputra River, which many of you might be aware of. And there are several tributaries which feed into the big river. And over the years, there have been a lot of movements of these communities who migrate from the hilly parts of the state to the floodplains and vice versa, so that they can benefit and also adapt to the monsoons in the region. The history of floods in Assam actually dates back to 1950, when there was actually a strong earthquake that lasted for around 8 minutes. which claimed around 1,000 lives. And since then, floods, the oral history that people share tends to note that floods have since then become annual phenomenon. And then on top of that, the construction of dams and hydroelectric projects tend to add to the geomorphic vulnerability of the region, causing several floods within a year. I started this study, I think in 2012, when the floods had happened, and I was sent to do an assessment. Since then, I have visited the state almost 5 times and visited different districts in the state and looked at different ways in which communities have adapted to these floods. The districts that I've been involved in were Moregaon, Lakhimpur, Dhemaji, Sonitpur, which was flooded for the first time in 2012, for the first time in the last 12 years at that point. It is now part of Biswanath district. So sorry for going into details, but it's just the state itself has such a varied history and relationship with floods that it's sometimes important to not only give the topographical significance, but also to see how different communities across these different districts have different patterns of living with the floods. Unfortunately, in India, internally displaced people are not actually treated as refugees. They are overlooked in many of these development policies and do not get any legal recognition or support. And internally in Assam also, there is a lot of hesitation to include refugees because a lot of immigrants from Bangladesh have also settled in the region over the years before 1970s, when the Assam Accord was brought into place. So there is a lot of complexity when we consider internal displacement in Assam itself. And like Professor Chaya, who went before me, mentioned the grid report and IDMC data, which was generated in 2021, it sets the context to actually look at how small scale and localized displacement should also be studied. And this kind of framing is especially important in Brahmaputra region in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. So there is a transboundary governance aspect as well here. Just before I go into the details of the different parts of different types of displacement, I wanted to state that the fieldwork that I conducted were mostly ethnographic in nature. So I would interact with the community members, I would interview some government stakeholders and a lot of NGOs who have been working in the region. I myself had consulted different NGOs who had been part of the response in 2012, 2013. And then there was a conflict that had happened in Kokrajhar and Chirang, where I was again part of the response team as well. So the frequent floods in Assam actually created 4 distinct types of displacement. One is temporary in nature, which is maybe lasting a week or less, or maybe more, which is due to waterlogging. So the flood happens, people immediately have to go to a safer space. They would either go to a school, or to a temple, which is called Namghar in the region, or makeshift embankment, makeshift camp in the embankment. The second kind of displacement that you would see is actually voluntary or forced permanent, because people actually give away their land either to construct an embankment so that the villages don't get flooded in the next year. This is again of a very political in nature, because how these lands are allocated for construction of embankment is also a process in itself. The third kind of displacement that you would see is permanent displacement due to erosion. So along with floods, one of the biggest challenges that Assam faces is riverbank erosion, the cutting of land because of the river's force. And the land which is lost due to erosion can never be regained back. And a lot of communities actually live in chars, which is the char or sapuri. So in people from Bangladesh who have joined us today might know, or even in West Bengal, this is a quite common phenomenon where these chars are actually considered to be very fertile. So people would use this land for cultivating or for letting their cattle graze there. And the fourth kind of mobility that I have observed is the out migration. So people completely leave either for work or because of the vulnerability of the region. And most often it's the men who leave to cities, and the women, children, and elderly are often left behind. So they are responsible for relocating. They are responsible for recovery of the household when floods keep recurring annually. So in each of these mobility patterns, it is very interesting to observe how women and their experiences and adaptive capacities differ across social and ethnic groups. For example, let me just talk about this one particular village, which is called in Morigaon, which is called Kacharigaon. So in Kacharigaon means that it's a camp settlement. So for over decades, the people who live in this village have actually shifted and come and live together. And in 2012, again, when this village, when I visited the village for the first time, more than hundreds of households were displaced. Again, when I went back in 2013, they had early, before the floods had started, they had received some shelter from an NGO. Around 50 households had received makeshift, temporary, not temporary, but like intermediate, so using local materials. But then when I visited again during the monsoons, relocate because of the construction of an embankment there. And as the monsoon progressed, the new embankment was also breached because it was constructed over a water body. And so within the same year, they were displaced almost 3 times because of not only the impact of disasters, floods and erosion, but also the way in which these policies and the construction of flood protection measures were actually adding to their vulnerability and risks. So it's very interesting to see how the phenomenon that we call as disaster-induced displacement is actually bigger than just being caused by disasters, especially the term that we often use, natural disasters. One of the common strategies that you would find in across communities in Assam is the construction of changars. So they will construct their home on a raised stilt using bamboos so that the water logging happens below and their stuff is not affected. So the houses are on a raised platform. But this is also only common in the areas where the water tends to flash floods, so where flash floods happen, so in the upper reaches of Brahmaputra. But in districts like Moregaon, where the water stays for a longer number of days, in those areas, construction of bamboo houses is not the practice. They would actually construct a raised platform, and on that they would want to build a house. But this is also the region where erosion is very rampant. So even if you invest money and build a raised platform, next year, if the land gets eroded, then you lose out on your economic investment. So even though we find different kind of strategies, it's actually all based on the capacities, economic resources, and social support that these households have. And on top of that, when you find these kind of different mobility patterns, it's often the responsibility of women who relies on remittances which come from her husband or her brother or some elderly member of the household family who will send money. And it's often very bare minimum to just ensure food, education, and basics for the household. So to invest in the recovery of an household and to construct race platforms or to adapt any kind of flood resilient strategy, not only for shelter, but also for water and sanitation structures, it's all comes at an additional cost. And the social support and access to these kind of technicians or masons is also not that easily available. I have also noted down aspects of menstrual hygiene, but I do not want to go into much detail there because it's not, I don't think we have enough time. The last idea that I wanted to share was about the mobility of these households tends to be one of their coping strategies. So given the vagaries of nature, they try and adapt to the situation based on what has happened to them in the past. And since year after year, flooding has become such a common phenomenon, you find that they have now adapted different strategies. So they will bulk purchase land or bulk purchase equipment or seeds, and so that the risk of investment is shared across 3 or 4 households. So this enables them to at least ensure that there is some kind of food security. They can grow, receive, they have some food grains available. This is also true for homesteads. So they will also do this for constructing their homes. But like we said, erosion is something that is beyond their control. And that is why the forced relocation due to erosion seems to be a bigger challenge that neither the government nor NGOs are able to address given the circumstances. I would like to conclude at this point by highlighting again the two main messages for my talk today. One being that the different kinds of mobilities, and not all of them are a direct consequence of disasters. A lot of them are political and the result of development projects as well. And secondly, the impact that these different kinds of mobilities have on women and children need to be further studied and understood in order to strengthen our response to displacement. I hope I made justice to the time that you've all given to me. I'm open to questions. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Sneha Krishna. That was, I think, a very elaborate presentation, really fleshing out the intricate mobility patterns, but also, as you said, the different dynamics involved in sort of in the context that in which people are sort of pushed to move or take the decision to move or stay. I mean, I think in both cases, the decisions are extremely complex. And also, as you say, unless we understand the gendered aspect, the diversity sort of positions involved in that, we will not be able to appropriately respond to those complex dynamics. And thank you very much for sticking to time. So actually, according to the schedule, we should have had one more speaker, which was Professor Anil Gupta from National Institute of Disaster Management. Unfortunately, we just got a message that he will not be able to join us today. So I would like to then pass the floor directly to our fourth speaker, the last speaker on the list today. And that will be Ms. Malavika Rao from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. And she will be talking about whether internal migrants in India who cannot return home due to COVID-19 be treated. So posing this question, should they be treated as disasters IDPs or not? And sort of looking at lessons from India on that. So Ms. Malavika, if I can pass the floor to you now.
Sure. Thank you, Anna. I hope I'm audible, and thank you for moderating this discussion. Hello to everyone, and hi to my fellow speakers. My name is Malavika Rao, and I'm a PhD candidate in international law at the Graduate Institute, Geneva. My work in this area spans across understanding internal displacement and the legal regimes in India, but more so for my PhD in international migration law, human rights, and climate change. So in the discussion that I'm going to have today, I will be borrowing from my contribution in the Refugee Survey Quarterly, where I wrote an article on the aftermath of COVID-19 in India on stranded workers, migrant workers, and the legal implications of that. So focusing on the legal response allows us to reflect on how we can categorize these persons and also how to categorize COVID-19 as a disaster in the hope that in the future disasters that come, we are better equipped in dealing with situations such as this. So firstly, a little bit about my topic. It's based on the research that I wrote in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19. So we saw that in March of 2020 that the Indian government issued an executive order that stranded migrant workers across the country need to be protected, and that we need to deal with this and address the needs of stranded migrant workers because of several human rights violations that we saw. And while I saw this in the news, I also saw a lot of reports that said that, that termed these people as migrant workers mostly, but also said that these people were, this was an exodus, this was a move, this was a return of people from cities to villages, and similar narratives. So this led me to think that, is the term migrant worker the appropriate term to refer to persons such as these? Or are there many more, or is there a deeper analysis that is required for us to kind of understand what the legal problem is? In hindsight, if we see the legal response, we see that everything came as a reaction. Everything came as a reaction to sort of help these people survive these kind of destitute situations. But rather, if we had a better categorization of this from the beginning, we would be better equipped to deal with it. So my discussion today is in two parts. The first is to try and address the problem of categorization. By this, I mean, how do we identify these people? How do we recognize such people for the purposes of the law? And how do we conceptualize this concept for for addressing future disasters? And the second is the problem of integration. So how do we integrate the concept of internal displacement within our domestic legal frameworks? And how does the Disaster Management Act of 2005 provide us with a legal venue to do so? So for the first one, if we go back to the facts that followed upon issuing the national lockdown, we saw that a lot of migrant workers from cities started, going back by foot to their villages. And if we notice that the pattern of movement in this kind of scenario, we understand this better. So in ordinary circumstances, when all of these migrant workers moved from rural areas to the cities, we see that the motivation there was something of a voluntary nature. It was mostly for them to ensure that their livelihoods are met, and it was also for them to come for the purposes of employment. But what happened with COVID-19 was the opposite of that. What happened there was that a lot of people were very scared of the consequences of their displacement, simply because they didn't have employment and they lost their sources of livelihood overnight. So they went back to their rural areas, or they tried to go back to their rural areas in the hope that they would be able to survive. So by noting this pattern of movement, we understand that the pattern in which they came to cities was more of a voluntary nature, giving them the identification of the category of migrant workers. But when they went back, it was more on motivated by force, motivated by their decision to flee and to be displaced on account of human rights violations because of the national lockdown. So in such a scenario, calling them migrant workers is inappropriate. They might be migrant workers, sure, for the purposes of identifying them. But beyond that, they're internally displaced persons, because the pattern of movement is one of internal displacement and not of voluntary migration. So if we go to the international level, I would like to touch upon how international law looks at this. So internal displacement is a concept that is ingrained in the guiding principles on internal displacement. It is a soft law instrument, which means that it's not a codified law, which means that the purpose of this is to have guidelines that countries can use within their domestic legal frameworks. So, and beyond this, if you look at scholarly work in this area, I'd like to quote two scholars. The first is Professor Walter Kalin, who kind of conceptualizes internal displacement. So internal displacement is always something that has an element of force, and internal displacement can happen in the process of reverse migration, such as in the case of the standard migrant workers in India. The second, adding to this, is the research of Professor Vincent Choutai, who also says that we always have to look at the fluidity of such categories. So in this case, this group of people are migrant workers, but because of the fluidity of categories, they can be internally displaced persons at the same time, both simultaneously and consecutively. So for instance, a refugee can be an internally displaced person, a refugee can be a migrant worker can become a refugee, a migrant worker can also become an internally displaced person, such as in this case. So having these foundational understandings helps us to have a renewed perspective on this problem. And by looking at that, we understand that this is a problem of internal displacement. So moving on from this to the second issue that my work tried to tackle, that's a problem of integration. Now that we understand it's a problem of, of internal displacement, how do we deal with this legally? So if we look at what happened with the case of the migrant workers, we see that the government of India issued executive orders under the Disaster Management Act of 2005. Now, my argument and my claim is that this is the appropriate venue to do so, because the Disaster Management Act is the national legislation that already has a framework to deal with displacement from disasters. The fact of the matter is different, that all the disasters that we have dealt with until now are natural disasters. So we have mostly dealt with cyclones, we have mostly dealt with tropical storms, floods. All of these have been issued orders under the Disaster Management Act, and we have had a framework to prevent, mitigate, and manage the disasters. So the venue of the Disaster Management Act is appropriate. It's just that we need a more nuanced understanding of how this needs to be done. So for that, the first thing that is required is to understand the disaster at hand. So with COVID-19, the disaster that we had was the pandemic, but there is no precedence of understanding a pandemic as a disaster in India, and it's also fragmented at the international level. So that requires a deeper, inquiry into the articles of the Act, into the sections of the Act. So I began my research by just skimming over the NDMA's website, which is the National Disaster Management Authority. And if you look at their website, they have different classifications of disasters. On the one hand, you have natural disasters like tropical storms, cyclones, floods, all of these. And on the other hand, there's something known as a man-made disaster. So man-made disasters are in the nature of biological disasters and also nuclear disasters. So if you look further closely into this, and this is also mirrored in Section 2D of the Disaster Management Act, you will see that biological disasters are something that are caused or conveyed by biological vectors, and which include pandemics and epidemics. So when you have something like this, you have an understanding that pandemics and epidemics are disasters, and more importantly, they're disasters for the purposes of the Disaster Management Act. So when the government of India issued this executive order, it is understood that they issued this as in the phraseology of COVID-19 as an epidemic, which means that it's a biological disaster. However, the response that was triggered, the legal response that was triggered because of this, did not comply with the framework in the Act. And that's a problem. And that's a problem because we simply do not have precedence of dealing with something like COVID-19. Now, if we look further in the international arena, we have something of a similar nature of trying to understand biological hazards as disasters that can cause or trigger internal displacement. This is given in the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, and it's also mentioned in the Sendai Framework of Disaster Risk Reduction. Moreover, if we go back to 2014, when we saw the Ebola virus outbreak, we can see that there were 5 principles that were issued, which help us understand how disasters such as pandemics can be construed as triggering internal displacement. So with the Ebola episode, what we saw was that in case a disaster or a pandemic triggers, people or internal displacement, because people are fleeing the virus, because people are fleeing quarantine regulations or lockdowns, because people are fleeing stigma which is associated with the pandemic, and also because of forced evictions that come with it, or simply because of violence and human rights violations that happen because of the mismanagement of the disaster. All of these things constitute a very integral aspect of what we understand, disasters to be. So if we look at it from this perspective, then we understand that the lockdown measures are well within the integral aspects of managing the disaster, which is why people fleeing lockdowns are people fleeing biological disasters, which means that they're fleeing internal displacement and they're not voluntary migrants. So once we have this kind of an understanding that these persons are not just stranded migrant workers, but they're also internally displaced persons. And number two, that the Disaster Management Act is the appropriate legal venue. One needs to question what the utility of something like this is. So firstly, I think that this aligns, this sort of reasoning or this line of reasoning aligns with the object and purposes of the Disaster Management Act. We already have a framework that is capable of addressing disasters. All we need to have is improve our understanding on nuanced drivers, such as pandemics. Secondly, it also gives us a plan of action for dealing with something in the future. So we can take precautionary approaches rather than scrambled and ad hoc reactionary approaches that do not address the violations that people face. And finally, it's also important to understand that the notion of internal displacement is already existing in the Disaster Management Act, simply not in the terminology of internal displacement, but it exists in the terminology of evacuation, rescue, rehabilitation, providing compensation, all of these which mirror the basic principles of the guiding principles on internal displacement. So my conclusions are as follows, and I hope to touch upon this more in the question answer session, but the conclusions are as follows. One, movement of stranded workers is not voluntary migration, but internal displacement, and the implications of the national lockdown need to be looked upon as acts of displacement and not as voluntary migration. Number two, the Disaster Management Act is the appropriate legal venue to address something like this. However, having said that, it needs to be amended to explicitly include internal displacement as part of the response framework. We have seen in Union of India versus Vijay Mam in 2011, where the Supreme Court has clearly stated that the guiding principles on internal displacement are very important for us to understand internal displacement in India. However, there hasn't been any progress made in this field, and I hope that we take this as an opportunity to do so. And lastly, there are many international implications of this, because the events that followed, lockdowns in India are not specific to India. We saw similar things happening in countries in Latin America and China as well. So understanding this tightens the link between disaster and displacement and better equips countries to deal with them. Over 140 countries in the world already have disaster management laws in some form or the other. They have it as national legislations, they have it as executive agencies, they have it as hazard management agencies or civilian protection and defense bodies in their governance. So we have this kind of solution in front of us. It's just that we need to be able to adapt these laws to better deal with crises. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Malavika. That was a very well-structured and a very comprehensive presentation that you've given. And indeed, thanks for highlighting how ill-prepared, well, not only India, but in fact, the world was to deal with disaster that came in the form of pandemic, and also that interacted with various forms of other disasters in the meantime. Also, thanks for highlighting the legal aspects, because it's in fact not only an issue in India. I believe it's actually in many countries where you would not have an explicit mention of the IDP context in the legal text, but you would have sort of references to evacuation, to different sort of aspects of movement. But then it's a valid question to pose, then, is that enough sort of to address the whole spectrum of different mobilities, also from what we heard from Professor Sneha just speaking before, so the complexities that could be involved in that. Before opening the floor to Q&A, I would like to also use my position as a chair and also perhaps ask a question that I think sort of to everyone to start off the discussion, and then we can pick up on the questions that came in the chat. Before sort of starting the Q&A session, I would like to highlight, so this webinar is actually co-convened by the Internal Displacement Research Program, IDRP, which is a specialized initiative at the University of London that supports and disseminates cross-disciplinary research on internal displacement, especially in affected countries. And today, so our focus is on India. And so we also host the Researching Internal Displacement website. As Professor Chaya Badraj in the beginning indicated, that's also where you can find a lot of publications on these issues. So just to bring you the sort of, today we already heard a variety of presentations while focusing on India, but revealing very different aspects of this issue of internal displacement, and specifically displacement in the context of disasters and climate change. So to link this, I think it's valid to pose this question. So when we talk about disasters, maybe our own understanding of disasters is still, too limited. I think there's been a lot of literature, especially in the field of human geography, but also beyond that, highlighting that disasters are in fact never natural. Hazards could be natural, but disasters are not. And also hazards could be biological, like in the case of COVID-19, but disasters are not. There's also always sort of, human vulnerabilities that are socially constructed, economically mediated, and politically sort of aggravated that lay at the bottom of this issue. So this is a question to all three speakers to sort of to say, is there something that we should change in terms of our just conceptualization of disaster is to better understand the different types of movements that disaster-induced sort of displacement, and not just displacement, but different variety of movements, also as highlighted by Professor Sneha, because there's different sort of spectrum of voluntary decision-making and forced decision-making that is involved. So do we need to reconceptualize perhaps our concept of disasters to start with? Thank you. So perhaps maybe we can start with Chaya.
My immediate answer to your question, Dr. Anna, would be yes. We need a complete reconceptualization of the way we legally and conceptually understand the term disasters. Because for a lot of, say, for at least last century, we have only known disasters as an act of God, as something that naturally occurs in the society. And we haven't, specifically, we talk about the way cultures look at disaster. Cultures haven't looked at disasters as something which are anthropocentric or as an act of man. And only we were able to disseminate this information that disasters are an act of man, and only if we were able to limit, restrict, or manage the human activity in relation to a hazard or in relation to the risks that natural geological environment poses to us, then we will be able to limit the larger scope the larger negative consequences of that hazard converted into a disaster, then I think a lot of changes can happen in the society, and particularly in the context of protection of people. So right now we are talking a lot about how people are affected due to disasters. They need to relocate, they need to change their habitual places of residences. They are forced to leave their houses and move to places where they may not have their cultural, social, political roots. So I think in that context, only we are able to reconceptualize the understanding of the term disasters. We will be able to prevent it at the cause itself, and not, and in a way, by not allowing the hazard to convert into a large-scale disaster. So that's my answer or comment to the larger comment that you made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chaya. Thank you. Maybe we could then ask Professor Sneha. Yes, can you connect?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
This is a very tough day with the internet. I think, yes, a lot of multiple understandings and reinterpretations of disasters are occurring across disciplines, across different actors as well. So the government officials would look at disasters differently versus how they would, say, for example, people who work in IT would look at disasters. So something which could be breach of data, for example, for a bank or some private organization, that could itself be considered as a situation which could lead to a lot of people's personal information and data being vulnerable. And we've seen many examples of this during COVID-19 itself, when all the education and everything was happening online. So I think across different sectors and different spheres, we are reconsidering what we mean by disasters. But yes, a shared lens and a shared understanding is something that we have to work towards. And something as big as disaster-induced displacement, which is so vague and which is not even considered as under the refugee protection laws, we have to really go back to the drawing board so that there are no ambiguities, there are no potentialities, because after all, people who live on the front line, people who are dealing with the impact of these disasters day in and day out, they would not have resources and access to information which will help them gain compensation, for example. And I say this with utmost destitution to say that since 2012, the households that were flooded, they never received compensation. So no matter how much we try to push policy forward, these ambiguities are actually making life difficult for people who are bearing the brunt of climate change. And so therefore, yes, we can all agree and we can all disagree and we can all go back to the drawing board, but people who are living with disasters, for them, their understanding and their day-to-day needs which are not being met is actually much more of a graver concern than the annual flood that happens. So I think when we look at perspectives also, we get a different, we reshape our own understanding of disasters as well. And I think if everyone who's listening in here can actually look at their own assumptions and biases and what they consider as disaster, they will find answers as to whose perspective are they missing out on.
Thank you. That's no, it does. I think it really does. So to add that perspective, we need a bottom-up understanding of what disaster is, in fact, from the perspective of people who are really affected and bear the brunt of these different changes, environmental changes on the ground. Thank you very much, Professor Sneha. So Ms. Malavika, if you could add any points, I think your presentation already highlighted that, but perhaps you could flesh out more. Thank you.
Thank you for asking me this question. And also, I think it's important because, like you mentioned, on the one hand, you have hazards, right? Like COVID-19, which is a biological hazard. But the transition of this becoming a disaster includes or involves many other things. And I would like to go back again to the IDMC report, which is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center's report on the Ebola virus into 2014. And if you look at that, it's sort of like a package. The disaster itself includes the hazard, yes, but it also includes a lot of other patterns of movement that we try to comprise. So in this case, it was, people fleeing the virus, people fleeing stigma, any associated violence or human rights violations, or simply, because of sudden quarantine and lockdown measures. So understanding the package is very important in dealing with the hazard itself. So, and this understanding, I believe that with more disasters, hopefully not, but with the disasters that come, I think we'll have a better understanding. So I would say that we need to keep our minds open to understanding clearly and comprehensively what the different impacts could be on the lives of people.
Thank you, Vika. That was very powerful, in fact. So I think we need to be prepared to what is actually, policymakers are very quick to label something as unprecedented because it takes off their responsibility to, to some extent, to have sort of prepared and planned for such an issue. But I don't think, we're no longer living in a world where anything should be described as unprecedented because anything can happen. As also, and that's not only the sphere of disaster, unfortunately, there's also, in the sphere of human behavior, as we have seen recently with what's happening in Ukraine, for example. So I think really you have highlighted that it's of course, we need to really think out of the box in terms of how we prepare and plan for and how our tools are, like the legal tools out there to deal with it. So now I would like to open the floor to questions. And first we will have, I noticed there are some questions in the chat. So I think the first question is addressed to Professor Chaya. And this is a question from Sanya Kishwar. She is asking, so do you think there is a need for full-fledged conversation on, sorry, it's a bit hard to get the whole question. So here it is. So do you think there is a need for full-fledged conventions to be drafted and enacted to address internal displacement? So as it is, as it was also mentioned in Malavika's presentation, we only have sort of soft law guidelines that are then supposed to be guiding principles that are then supposed to be domesticated into domestic law. But of course, the extent to which they are domesticated really differs. So that's a query for you, Professor Chaya, if you think there should be a convention. Or alternatively, she's asking, would dedicated municipal sort of laws be more effective? So having all this diversity of different tools at the local level. And she's also saying the internal displacement in a country like India comes with many problems, other than a relocation, obviously, other than movement. One of them is a struggle to get compensated despite a government scheme in that regard. So perhaps you could also add something to that. So Chaya, if you want to answer that question, and if anyone else from the panel would like to speak, please. Chaya, thank you.
So my immediate answer again to whether we should have an international convention on internally displaced persons, my answer would be yes. But then the question that follows with an international convention is related to the enforceability, effectivity, and so on and so forth. And these two terms, the question of enforceability and effectivity, is also attached with national laws or legislations. So enforcement remains a challenge in both the cases. So although I would want the states to assume a legal responsibility and move forward from a soft law approach to a more hard law, legal binding obligations under international law, again, however, the political will be a challenge to it. Again, moving forward to the next question, whether we should have a national legislation dedicated to specifically to the disaster-induced internal displacement, my answer would be yes. It would be better to conceptualize our understandings of disasters. It would also help us to conceptualize who can be covered within the meaning of disasters and disaster-induced internally displaced persons. Do we include people who are affected by pandemics like COVID-19? Do we include people who are affected by industrial disasters? For example, the Bhopal gas tragedy in India, or the recent LG Polymers industrial gas tragedy that happened. Do we include people who are affected by these industrial disasters within the understanding of disaster-induced displaced persons as well? And we could also, through the legislation, probably draw a boundary on the overlapping complexities that otherwise happen. For example, there's a complexity between conflict-induced internal displacement and otherwise disaster-induced internal displacement. So whether conflicts induced displacement would be covered under disaster-induced displacement or not. So these sort of clarifications could be addressed in national legislations. And national legislations, and I'm being a little more optimistic, can highlight a mechanism in order to distribute financial benefits specifically to the people who are in the most vulnerable cycle of the society when affected or when dealing with the challenges of displacement. However, again, I think the enforceability and effectivity of it would remain a challenge. I hope that answers your question. I would also, I think Malvika should also throw some light on what she thinks about these questions.
Thank you, Chaya. So my opinion on this is slightly different. I think you highlighted something very important, that political will to come together to do something like this is always a challenge, and but that's not a new challenge for anything related to migration. And I think that the key here is actually soft law instruments. We have seen that even with the Global Compact on Migration, the Global Compact for Refugees, which came out in 2018. So I think the point of soft law instruments here is to kind of channelize the political will in a way in which countries feel it's flexible for their own factual context. So in India, I think that if we were to have a national law on internal displacement, it would be really beneficial, but because we have a lot of internal displacements happening every year, but also because the context of these is very different from other countries. Like in India, I think cyclones, conflict, and now in the last 2 years, the pandemic has played, have been important drivers. So thinking about it from a top-down perspective also helps because we can gather the principalities of what we need to do. With respect to having a new law, of course, with my own research, I kind of touched upon what was feasible, what was a practical recommendation at this point to kind of follow up on what we had with the disaster, with the COVID-19. And also it was a follow-up to the sort of executive action we had. So all of it came under the mandate of the Disaster Management Act, which is why I analyzed if that itself was the appropriate legal venue. But of course, I mean, if future discussions were to happen on having a national law which is dedicated just for this purpose, I think it's very beneficial.
Sorry, thank you very much, Malavika. Thanks for highlighting that. You've highlighted both sort of different aspects of this, and also I think Malavika especially fleshed out the complex issue of political will and how to sort of mobilize that I think the recent, report of the high-level panel on internal displacement that looked at this question actually also highlighted how complex it is. To mobilize that not only it has been known to be a complex issue because primarily before internal displacement has been focused on sort of conflict-induced displacement, but even in disaster-induced, it can be equally politicized and sort of misused for various political agendas. Now, perhaps if Sneha, do you want to add something to this, or maybe on this aspect of whether, because I think there was two levels to this question. Another was of whether sub-national sort of, specification of rules and regulations would be more beneficial. And you've talked specifically about the need to know the context and to sort of the intricate dynamics that are very contextualized in each displacement situation. Perhaps Sneha, you could add something on that?
Absolutely. I think not just subnational, but also transboundary. So some of the challenges, especially, yes, I agree, we are focusing today on internal displacement, but if you look at displacement as a phenomenon, a lot of countries have to share the challenges. For example, my other work that I do is with the Rohingya refugees who leave Myanmar and come to Bangladesh. So they are leaving a country due to conflict, and they are not even considered as refugees in Bangladesh. But Bangladesh in itself is facing so much at a high rate, the impact of disasters, finding it difficult to adapt and survive and continue living in Cox's Bazar in very deteriorated conditions. So I think, and then you have people from Bangladesh who actually come and migrate to a country like India. So I think there is this chain of movements which is happening across countries. And for this, more than a country response, it actually has to be a concerted effort through the regional, as a sub-regional response. And this is true for the countries that I mentioned in South Asia. It's true for the European countries who tend to have different approaches to the migrants from Greece or other island countries, right? So I think the phenomenon itself is now becoming so complex that any one country may not be able to have the right answers for this. And therefore, it becomes detrimental to what the other countries are trying to achieve. So if Bangladesh explicitly doesn't consider Myanmar as refugees, they still have to provide for the people who are living in their country, right? So how can then countries like India, who also host Rohingya refugees, countries like Nepal, who also provide some kind of economic job opportunities, how can then we come up with solutions? Because maybe in a world from now on, like maybe 10 years, these boundaries would not have any more meaning. And therefore, looking at responses which will build capacities of each other's countries would also be hugely beneficial. I know it's a very radical idea, but I think that's where we should aim at and get at.
Yeah, in an ideal world, definitely. I mean, I agree with you. We need that transboundary perspective, definitely. Also to position the sort of the context of what is happening and the understanding within the broader context of international relations, as well as, as this concept of, well, maybe this is too radical, but planetary boundaries in a way, also because we are living, I mean, despite this national border, we are, sharing one single planet. So thank you for that. I think there are questions on the chat also. So I would like.
I got someone. If I
yes, I just wanted to raise it one for you. So there was also a question for you, Sneha. So asking that during COVID-19 migrant crisis, many women walked for thousands of kilometers to reach home, and then in terms of if you could highlight any measures to sort of to bring their voices to the fore. So the gender perspective of this massive exodus that happened following COVID lockdowns.
Honestly, of course, there's no need to question that approach at all. But having said that, my work has not been as detailed as Malvika has presented. But I can share my experience of working with the frontline workers. So the Ashas and Anganwadi workers who were part of the frontline response in India, how they were tasked with the responsibility of undertaking surveillance, managing COVID-19 cases.
Sneha, I think we are losing you because of the connection. So if you could repeat just what you said, I think we lost part of what you said. Sneha, are you there with us? Okay. Maybe. Well, Sneha, I don't think we can hear you, so I will need to I think we will need to come back to you, Sneha. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. Okay. So maybe in the meantime, Malavika, you could address also, I mean, there was this question to you asking, the government called the people on the roads during COVID-19 as migrants and not internally displaced people, persons. So can we really categorize all these migrants as IDPs? Like, would they be appropriate? And also there was a relevant question to that. I mean, again, do you categorize them all as IDPs? Is that the way to go? So up to you, Malavika. Thank you.
Thank you. I also had a small follow-up to the previous question on regional action. I think that a good model for us to look at is what's happening in the international counterpart of refugee law at the regional level. So good examples of that are the Cartagena Declaration and the Organization of the African Union Convention. So these are two good instruments where regional action has been mobilized to cater to the specific needs of the region. So it also highlights the need for us to think about something in the Indian subcontinent as well. But moving on to this question, I think, let me just clarify. So what I meant by, the basis of categorizing these people as internally displaced persons is by specifically looking at the pattern of their movement. And I think that that's very different from the way in which voluntary migrant workers move every year. It could be because of seasonal employment. It could be for, just securing their livelihood needs in cities, in urban areas. So if you look at, if you go through my article as well, I kind of highlight the sectors in which all of these migrant workers work. It's mostly manufacturing, construction, infrastructure, all of those. But I think that there's a difference. I think that there's a difference when it comes to looking at the pattern of movement in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that here it's very different because there is an element of force which is involved, which is not included in other patterns of voluntary migration. So that's something that is key to this distinction and key to this analysis of construing them as internally displaced persons.
Excellent, thank you. So as you meant, I mean, in fact, that we should look at what made this movement different from other sort of regular labor migration movements. So also perhaps linking, that to the question of, because I think this was raised also in, I'm not sure if Sneha is with us. Sneha, are you with us? Oh, maybe not. Okay. Well, that's unfortunate because I wanted to link it back to what she was saying. But in any case, so now I wanted to actually ask, so I've asked people to sort of to write their questions, but if there are anyone who would like to make an intervention, and I know we might have some technical issues here, but in case anyone would like to raise their hand and take the floor, please let me know. To ask questions. Well, if not yet, then I have an additional question for perhaps for you two to consider. So also considering that, so you both mentioned, so one is, on the aspect of reporting. And I think to you, Chaya, also considering the fact that, reporting on disaster-induced displacement is incomplete in many ways, as you also highlighted in your article. And you've highlighted that through the example of, internal displacement, disaster-induced displacement in India. But it's in fact incomplete. What we have is at best guesstimates for disaster displacement around the world. Now, I was also thinking that we have an even bigger issue when we think about displacement in the context of development projects, and also how in some cases we could think of situations where, effectively in the context of intensifying climate crisis and also, other types of disasters that we are witnessing today, we're also seeing that past development practices are increasingly rendered unsustainable. So in that sense, we're also seeing a situation where there is a nexus between disasters, displacement, and unsustainable development in a way. And by that, I also mean, for example, rapid expansion of cities, uncontrolled urbanization, evictions that, are also followed through that. So I would like both of you to sort of to reflect on that. What do you think about that increasing nexus? Is there a nexus between, unsustainable development, disasters, and displacement? And if so, how should we sort of, what should we do to address that? Perhaps Chaya, you could start.
All right. I think there is an intricate relationship between disasters, development, and unsustainable development or sustainable development, as we'd highlight. I did a study a couple months ago. The study was focused on Fiji. And we took Fiji as a case study, studying the relocation projects in Fiji. And we came across how one of the relocation projects took 7 years for relocation, or more than 7 years for the relocation project to be implemented. And instead of the whole village relocated from the coastal area to more mainland inside, only 7 houses were built on mainland inside during the course of these 7 plus years. Now, this is one of those examples or outliers or examples which highlight a negative linkage between protection of people and implementing a developmental or poverty alleviation or relocation project. And this particular case example led me to thinking that certain developmental projects can also cause, number one, cause unwanted impacts in lives of people. And instead of protecting their human rights or instead of protecting those people from the negative consequences of disaster, can leave them trapped in that disaster area or disaster zone. However, if I was to contextualize this whole linkage with whether these developmental projects or people who are forced to leave or forced to stay in the context of developmental related projects, should they be linked with disaster-induced displacement directly? I think my answer would be no. And this answer arises because of the past experiences that we have had, particularly in the context of India. So in India, we have a national legislation in which we protect those people, or guarantee them certain compensation if they are displaced because of a developmental projects, and because we've had a lot of dams that were built across India, and because of those dam building projects, a lot of people were forced to move out of their houses or their habitual areas of residences. So we have these internal displacements, or internal migrants as we'll call it, covered. And therefore, I think these stand distinct from disaster-induced displacement. However, I think in certain cases of a negative linkage between a developmental project that went wrong could lead to a disaster, but then that'll be a direct linkage with a development project causing a disaster and then causing internal displacement. So that's where I stand in relation to linkage between development projects and disaster-induced projects, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. So I think you've highlighted it. I mean, you've highlighted there are distinct aspects. So the first example, I think you talked about Fiji, that's not, I mean, normally you would not describe that as a development, you would describe it as planned relocation. And normally it takes time because it's extremely politically sensitive. Also, it's also about, I think in Fiji, according to their planned relocation policy, they require that at least 90, so it's not 100, it's not a anonymous, but it's 90% of, of households in that village or in that locality have to agree to relocation in order for relocation to actually happen. So it might in fact take 7 years or even longer for different people to agree on the terms and then to actually find out what could be the actual process. But I agree that, I mean, there's a lot to be learned. Why relocations are so feared also in the context of disasters is that because we have this negative experience with development-induced displacement and relocation projects there. But as you also highlighted, there are sort of distinct needs, and in Indian context, you have a sort of, as I understood, you have a distinct legal instrument to deal with that. Because I know that in many countries, despite having, for example, in Colombia, while they have an IDP policy, focusing on conflict and disaster-induced IDPs, or mostly on conflict-induced, they do not include people displaced by development projects, which is also a huge problem there. So, then by also having this national legislation, you create categories of people who have rights and who have no rights in a way. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that complexity. Malavika, sorry for making you wait. If you want to add something on that nexus, thank you.
I think Chaya's answer was quite comprehensive, and I don't think I'll be able to add anything for the very local context. But I think this, the link between, or the nexus between development projects and displacement is very important for us to consider as part of also the EIA process, which is the environmental impact assessment. It relates to some of the very fundamental principles of international environmental law, which take into account transparency, accountability, environmental impact on indigenous and rural communities, also the right of public participation of neighboring communities and things like that. So I think that judicial action, especially rulings from the Supreme Court, can enhance and strengthen this kind of this area. I think it's a good opportunity for that.
Thank you, Malavika. So thank you for highlighting that additional aspect, as you say. Sorry for all those that are participating. Could you please mute yourself because we can hear some background. I would try to come back to Sneha. Krishna, I'm afraid she's not with us. Sneha, are you there? No.
Yeah, I think she just texted me the city she is in right now has power cut off, so
Oh
she
no, I'm very sorry. Yeah.
to join us back.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a pity. Well, in the remaining few minutes that we have, I also wanted to highlight. So you've now, I think this webinar has, covered a great variety of different issues. And also we talked about the gender dimension is certainly there, the legal dimensions, the reporting dimensions. One thing perhaps for us, maybe, a more towards a question oriented towards sort of rounding up the session. We also often, hear now for some years, we've heard a lot on emphasis on solutions. So talking about that we really need to find solutions for people who are displaced. And of course, now after hearing the diversity of issues and also Malavika highlighting this, that how just because of the sudden lockdown measures, people who have been previously categorized as labor migrants have essentially turned into, people who were essentially displaced all of a sudden. But I think when we talk about solutions, we should also remember that this diversity of movements, of context, also means that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this issue. So in that sense, if you consider the discourse on solution, and I'm just talking about the discourse in general, in internal displacement, we normally talk about return. Often there is an emphasis on return, whether people want to return or not, local integration, or relocation or resettlement. And there is a slight difference between the two terms, but let's speak about, sort of finding solutions elsewhere, as it mentioned in the guiding principles. So anyone, do you think that, now it's to Chaya and to Malavika, how should we sort of, reorientate this discourse on solutions if we are to be more aware that there is this great diversity? And how, should we be talking about these three solutions, or should we be talking about a much wider spectrum of solutions? Thank you. Chaya, if you want to start.
I think we should be talking about much wider spectrum of solutions, because return, relocation, and resettlement is good. But I think at least in the context of India, and Malavika highlighted in her previous comment, that there is a need to also talk about environmental impact assessment. So in India, we have a lot of, because we are a developing economy, we are also striving at a lot of developmental projects. These projects can directly be linked with, say, hazard atlases that we have in India. So a developmental project or a residential project can be avoided to be constructed in a floodplain or in an earthquake-prone area. So this integration of environmental impact assessment can definitely help prevent a disaster-induced migration at the first instance. So preventive measures and integration of these into environmental impact assessments could be one of the solutions that we can talk about. And then apart from that, of course, relocation is another solution that I am highly inspired with, looking at how the small island countries are doing with relocation. But I also recognize that relocation could be challenging in the Indian context because of the population, resources, and infrastructure related issues that we have in India. It could be difficult but not impossible to actually think of a very effective relocation project in India. But I think there are certain projects which are underway and could help in the Indian context generally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Malavika, do you want to add something to that?
Mm-hmm. I have two very short points. One, I think that half the battle is won if we identify the problem in itself. So with that, I think that with the legal framework that we have at hand, we are capable of doing so. All we need to do is have an open understanding of nuanced drivers of displacement. Having said that, a practical recommendation would be that while I was doing research on the Disaster Management Act, I came across the National Disaster Management Plan. The last one was issued in 2019, and so the point of the plan is to plan for having a plan of action for all the stages of managing a disaster. So all of these recommendations like EIAs, relocation, resettlement, rescue, evacuation, compensation, all of these are dealt with under the plan. And the plan also points out the responsibilities of, or the division of responsibilities between state governments, national government, all the stakeholders involved, the role of civil society organizations, all of these things. So I think that we have a lot of work at hand to do, especially with everything that we have. So my fear with coming up with new solutions is that we haven't adequately dealt with the existing solutions that we have. So I would still like to emphasize that maybe we need to go back and reflect on the things that we already have and kind of highlight the mistakes that we've made and correct them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that was a really rich discussion, despite, we are being short on one of the speakers. So I think we've used up our 90 minutes. Thank you everyone for joining. I think I saw in the chat box, some people are asking about attendance sheets. There's no attendance sheet for this webinar. So it's free attendance. So in any case, thanks to everyone. And I hope, people who joined today could learn equally, a lot, as I personally did. Thank you very much, Chaya. Thank you very much, Malavika. And thank you to our other speaker, Sneha, who could not be with us until the end. And thank you very much to Jane, who has managed the back end for this webinar. Thank you, Jane, and thanks everyone for joining. So on that note, I would wish everyone a good evening. And yes, thanks again. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Anna.
Have a good evening. Thank you.